Okay, so today you have your second flip lesson, and you should be going to lesson 7. And if you haven't already, I'd like you to try the do now. Okay, unpause when you've finished trying it. So at this point, you've tried it and you're ready to review your answers. So for the first one, I'm going to break this down. Remember yesterday we talked about how to deal with negatives under the radical. So I'm going to break this down into -1 times 16 times 2. Remember, the square root of -1 is I. The square root of 16 is 4. And then 2 is going to stay under the radical. So my final answer here is 4i radical 2. Next, I have an I on the outside. I'm going to break this down with a -1, a 9, and a 2. So my -1 is going to become an I. The square root of 9 becomes a 3. And this is going to stay the square root of 2. So I have 3i squared radical 2. Remember, I squared is the same as saying -1. So this is -3 radical 2. Okay, so now we're going to try to determine different powers of I. So we know anything to the 0 is 1. And we also know that I to the first should just be I. I squared is -1. And then if we're thinking about I to the third, we could technically break that down into I to the first times I to the second to help us determine it. Remember, we knew I to the second was -1. So I times -1 is just -I. Okay, so far we have 1, I, -1, and -I. Now, I to the fourth, you could think of that as I squared times I squared. Well, that's -1 times -1. That's going to be +1. Here, I to the fifth, I squared times I to the third, right? I should break it down into things where I already know what the values are so I don't have to do extra work. That's like saying -1 times -I. So that's going to be +I. I to the sixth, if I do that, I could think of that as I to the third times another I to the third. So that's going to be -I times -I. So I have this. If I multiply those together, that's going to be I squared again, which is -1. And then I to the seventh, when I break that down, it's going to simplify to -I. So what you should notice here is I'm actually starting to get a pattern. So I to the 0 was 1, I to the first was I squared is -1, and I to the third is -I. When I go to I to the fourth, it's going to cycle back to 1. So when I'm looking at powers of I, they follow a cycle from 1, I, -1, back to -I. You'll never get any other value when you're cycling powers of I. So since it's a pattern of 4, you can take the exponent and divide it by 4. If it divides evenly, so like 0 when I divide by 4 divides evenly. If I do 4 divided by 4, that divides evenly. You know that's going to line up with this column, the I to the 0 pattern. It'll equal 1. If I take my exponent and I divide by 4 and I end up with a leftover here of 0.25, like 1 divided by 4 or 5 divided by 4 is 1.25, I'm going to end up in the pattern that follows the I to the first pattern, which is equal to I. Similarly, if I go here and I do 2 divided by 4, that's going to be 0.50. 6 divided by 4 is 1.50. So those will fall into pattern with the I to the seconds. the last one, if I do 3 divided by 4, I'm going to get 0.75. Anything when I divide by 4 that has leftovers of 0.75 will follow the I to the third pattern. So now we're going to try to apply this pattern over here. So if I take my 38 and I divide by 4, that's going to leave me with 9.5. If I have 0.5 as my leftovers, I go to this column here, and I'm going to say that this is the same as saying I squared. So this equals -1. I to the 22nd, or 21st rather, if I take 21 and divide by 4, I have 0.25 left over. So that's going to follow this pattern, my I to the first pattern. I to the first is the same thing as saying just I. Why don't you try C and D? Pause the video, try them. Okay, at this point you should have tried them. When you did your 40 divided by 4, you're going to get 10.0. So there was nothing left over. So you know that's going to line up with I to the 0. So it's 1. And then if you did your 83 divided by 4, you're going to get 20.75. And when you do that, if you have, so let's write that 83 divided by 4, 20.75. If you line that up, that's going to go with my I to the third pattern. So it's the same as saying I to the third, which is -I. So really, there's only 4 things you need to know. What I to the 0 is 1, I to the first is I squared is -1, and I to the third is -I. You have to line these up, whichever one has the similar leftovers. So now we can do a question like number 1. So for number 1, I want to simplify each of these i's. So I would do like 16 divided by 4. That's 4.00. I had nothing left over. If I have nothing left over, it's the same as thinking of 5 times I to the 0. My 23, if I take 23 and I divide by 4, I'm going to get 5.75. If I have 0.75 left over, it's the same as thinking of I to the third. And then 26 divided by 4 is going to be 6.50. So that's going to line up with I squared. So this is the same as thinking of I squared. Then I'm going to simplify. I to the 0 is 1. So this is 5 times 1. That's 5. I to the third is -I. So I'm going to write this as 3 times -I. I squared is -1. So now I'm just going to combine like terms. So this is going to be 4 because I have my 5 and my -1. And this is going to be -3i. I'm going to circle that. The next thing that I want to show you is how to do this on your calculator. And you can see at the bottom of the page, we kind of run through it a little bit. So if I open up my calculator, I need to click mode. I think I'm going to have to turn my screen sideways for it to work. So if I click mode, I need to go here, and I'm scrolling down, and right now it has real. I need to turn on A plus BI, and then I can quit out of that. Now, if I wanted to be able to type in this question we just did, I could do 5, and then over the decimal, there's an I button, so I can click second decimal, and then raise this to the 16th, arrow back down, plus 3, I need to pull up my I again, raise that to the 23rd, and then I to the 26th, same thing, pull up my I, raise it to the 26th, press enter. And that's the same answer we got before. And when we're doing multiple choice, you're allowed to just type this in your calculator. For short answer, you have to show some work. You can show your dividing by 4 work. Okay, let's go to the next page. Let's save this. I have to reopen it. So when you go to the next page, you're going to see they ask us to simplify something completely. So I want you to pause the video for a second and simplify this. When you're done, unpause. So here, when you did this, you knew I squared was -1. You knew I to the third was -I. So this is -2 plus 3I. We have a fancy name for this form. This is called A plus BI form. When you have a number that is in A plus BI form, we call it a complex number. Okay? The reason it's a complex number is it has a part that's real and a part that's imaginary. Whenever you have an I attached, you're imaginary. What I'd like you to do next is I'd like you to try the next few of these, and I'm going to post the answers for you guys for these. So please pause the video and complete them. Okay, at this point, you've completed these, and I'm just going to put the final answers up for you guys. If there's any that you got stuck on, please star them, and that's what we'll start with in class. I do want to say that for these, you have to do FOIL. You have to do double distribution. So if your answer is not agreeing with mine, go back and make sure that you did your double distribution. Okay. So make sure you bring this with you to class as evidence of completing your homework. And if there's anything you got stuck on, star it. So that's what we can start with tomorrow.